Guys, welcome to Log Smarter. Today we're going to be talking about total daily energy expenditure. If you don't know me, my name is Brandon Roberts, and I am the CSO over at Log Smarter. So before we get into too much, let me introduce myself a little bit more. So I am a kind of lecturer and research consultant at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Before that, I did a postdoc, which is the phase after a PhD, also at the University of Alabama at Birmingham in exercise medicine. And in the past couple years, I've really started to dig into the research of sports nutrition and nutrition in general, and also metabolism. So that's part of the research that I've done is integrated into this presentation. Now I have a PhD, master's, and bachelor's all from the University of Florida. As you can see right in front of you, I do a lot of content creation. So I'm also the CSO of Tailored Coaching Method. I write for examine.com. I have lots of content up on Revive Stronger, plenty of podcasts, Strength Guys, things like that. So you could find me, hopefully, everywhere. And then from a coaching perspective, I've been an online coach since 2015. So I started that right at the end of my PhD. And then I've been an in-person coach since 2012, and that was not a full client load, but a good number of clients during my PhD and master's. So today we're going to get into a few things, the first of which is why TDEE is important. Then we're going to go through the methods that are used to calculate TDEE, some BMR equations or resting energy expenditure. I'll use those interchangeably. Physical activity factors and how they can play a role and why they're important. Also, we will go back into BMR after that and define the components, get into a little bit of research in how we can change these components. And then I'll walk through the steps, they're pretty simple, on how to find your TDEE. And then I will show you here at Log Smarter why and how to use our software to find your TDEE. So, without further ado, what is it? What is energy expenditure, right? So TDEE is the total daily energy expenditure. It's the amount of energy you expend in calories in 24 hours. So we can find our basal metabolic rate depicted by this pie chart over here, and it's made up of different components. So we have BMR, NEAT, and thermic effect of food. We then take this number and we multiply it by a physical activity factor. And voila, you have a magical number that should give you maintenance calories. But that's not always the case. And as we'll get into later, there are some very large standard deviations with these equations. So to understand how we apply these equations, we need to know how they are created. So the best method and the most, let's say, inaccuracy, or we'll just say most accurate method, is the doubly labeled water method. The only problem with that is it's very expensive. We also have direct calorimetry, indirect calorimetry. We have the equations, and then we have our new method, Log Smarter, which is based off of a doubly labeled water study. Now, the doubly labeled water method is based on the difference between the turnover rates of hydrogen and oxygen in the body. So we have a lot of water in our body. We go through this. We also give off CO2. So we can drink doubly labeled water with heavy oxygen, and then we can measure it, usually through urine output, although there are some recent methods with muscle biopsies, muscle protein synthesis type stuff that we can use to measure rates. So essentially what happens is you drink it, it equilibriazed in your body, and then you pee it out. And we just measure via mass spec the amount of heavy oxygen in your CO2 and in your urine, and there we go. The nice part about this is there's no physical activity factor needed. So there is no guessing from clients or researchers, right? So we don't have to say, did you think you were a 1.2 or a 1.3 this last 2 months? We just know. Now, interestingly, this method was first used in the late 40s, and this was with a flock of trained racing pigeons. And the reason it was developed was so that you could, give animals water and then track them and track their caloric expenditure, much like humans. And it was later used in humans in like 1980s ish, and we've used it since then quite a bit. But again, it's very expensive, and not many people have access to it. So we move on to direct calorimetry. This is basically a jacket. So if you're ever in a research study and you are asked to stand, usually nowadays it's like a chamber, but you stand there and you just kind of stand open, and airflow is going through the chamber. There's a temperature measurement. There's a circulating jacket of water, so to keep humidity and temperature stable. And then there's an outflow chamber. And this is just like the double-labeled water, where we're measuring CO2 output. And we can use that and put it through a formula to get caloric expenditure. Now, this is kind of an older method and fairly rare anymore. I think there's probably a dozen of these chambers left in the United States. But we've gotten more practical with different other methods. One of those, or the main one really, is indirect calorimetry. So if you've ever been in a research study, what you do is you come in the morning, you're fasted, so no coffee. You lay on a bed, usually like a cot type thing, a hospital bed, and you are stable for hopefully 30 minutes before the researchers start their measurements. And during that time, you have a mask, or sometimes it's kind of like a space suit almost, over the top of you, and you're breathing out, and they're tracking CO2 output. And then basically what happens in this scenario is you get a CO2 output. It's calculated via computers and some other equipment. It's not as big and bulky as it used to be. These are generally used on metabolic carts. That's what a metabolic cart is, basically. So you can use it at rest. You can use it for exercise, but there's a lot of things you have to consider when you do that. And again, you get a CO2 output, an O2 output. You can plug them into the Weir equation, or the Weir formula down there at the bottom, and you have a BMR. So there are some issues with these equations I'm going to show you, and these are kind of important to keep in mind, because most equations, and all the ones I'm going to show you, are based off cross-sectional data. Now this means that a group of people came into the lab, we measured their metabolic rate via one of these methods I just talked about, and then we plotted it out, right? X, Y, you got a bunch of dots. And we can do groups of different people. Maybe we split them up by age, gender, pretty much anything we want. But it only gives us one time point. So we only know what their metabolic rate is at that time. That's why it's really important to make sure they're fasted, no caffeine, very relaxed, not like anxious or anything, because all of those things can increase metabolic rate. And so what we eventually get after we collect data for a while, hopefully this much data, we have a bunch of dots, a bunch of data points, X and Y, right? And to calculate an equation, all we do is stepwise regression. Now, we can pick how many variables we want to include in our regression, but most people will pick age, height, weight, gender. If you have FatFree Mass data, you can add that to your equation, or pieces and parts of all of them. And some of the equations we'll get into today have a little bit of everything. But that's all it is. It's just basically regression. And it gives you a line, an average of all those dots. Now, when we go to websites, so this is from TDEE they have these very elegant looking equation boxes, right? You're like, okay, well, I just put in my information and bam, I get a number. The only problem is we don't know most of the time. Some websites are okay. We don't know what equation they're using, and there are like 20. So that's an issue. Now you could just go into a bunch of different websites and average all of your equations. That's what a lot of people do. And that's not terrible, but we can get a little more accurate than that. So the equations we'll go over today are the Harris-Benedict, the Mifflin, Cunningham, De Lorenzo, Ten-Half, Tinsley, Mueller, and Owen. All of these are based on most of them are based on different populations, so we have to keep that in mind. And that's what I'm going to tell you today is who these equations are based on. So we have a variety of numbers here, sample sizes, and they range from 27, which is the Tinsley equation, which is a good equation, but only 27 people, so you have to remember that, up to 11,000 in the FAO WHO equation. Now, larger numbers are generally better in science, but when we start including all of these different demographics, these different countries, these different people, it makes our data very spread out. So you get larger standard deviations, or you may not be able to apply their data set to you. The other thing I wanted to point out is lean body mass. When we think of lean body mass, a lot of these equations have lean body mass or fat-free mass, kind of the same thing. There's some nuances, but for the purpose of this presentation, they're the same thing. And most people think that muscle has the highest metabolic rate, and that's completely understandable because by and large, on a whole body scale, muscle accounts for most of the difference in metabolic rate between you and I, mostly just muscle. And that's because our brains, hearts, liver, and kidneys are about the same size. Now, someone who's 5'5", 120 pounds, and someone who's 6'5", and 320 pounds are probably going to have different size organs, but that still doesn't account for that much. But again, that's another reason that we got to be careful with equations we use and what population they're based on. So the other thing I wanted to point out is adipose tissue. So adipose tissue is not very metabolically active, about 25% of muscle. Some people think it's not at all, but it does have some kind of energy usage, so we need to keep that in mind too. Another, not issue, but caveat or something to consider is fat-free mass, lean body mass, and how we calculate that. We have DEXAs, we have skin fold, we have BIA, InBodies, a newer one, we have bod pods, we have MRIs. There are a number of different methods, and some of these are really good. So DEXA is probably the most used, but DEXA wasn't necessarily designed to measure fat-free mass, lean body mass. It was designed to measure bone. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. Skin fold calipers are great if you have someone who knows how to use them. Now, if you walk into a gym and ask someone to skin fold you or caliper you, you may get wild different results depending on the person. So again, this is just for a single point in time. There are a whole another set of factors to consider if we want to track lean body mass over time. But this is just, hey, I want to figure out my TDEE, and this is the method I have. So my friend knows how to do calipers pretty well. I'm going to have him or her caliper me. Okay, or maybe I have access to an InBody. That would be pretty cool. So I'm going to use that. Now, the first equation I want to cover is the Harris-Benedict equation. It's the oldest equation. The original one was developed in the 1920s, essentially. It was based on 130-ish men, 103 women, and 94 infants. Now, I was an infant once, but I don't know that that applies, or I want that data in my BMR equation as an adult. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about these underlying populations these equations are based on. The more closely you identify with the population, the better. So fast forward to the 80s, 1984, I believe. Rosa et al. Had really gone through the data and realized that Benedict had been putting out this BMR data, but nobody has updated his formula. So they went in and they updated the formula. The main reason they did this was they wanted to show that critically ill patients, so think muscle wasting, cancer, heart diseases, they were malnourished. The equation didn't work for them. And that makes sense because most wasting conditions, you lose muscle, which is very metabolically active. So if I'm eating, a certain amount of calories and I lose a bunch of muscle, well, that's going to affect my maintenance. I digress. But it is a pretty cool story. So those are here. I'm not going to tell you exactly what they are, but they included mass or body weight, height, and age. Okay, so now we're into the 80s. Roses hasn't quite published their data set yet. Cunningham comes along and has 239 healthy adults. They excluded 16 of the trained athletes that were in the original Benedict equation, but it's essentially the same data set. There are more, but essentially the same people. Now, this equation was later revised in 1991, and that's, as you can see here, the Katch-McCardle equation. So the Cunningham and Katch-McCardle are essentially the same equation. There are some slight revisions and some slight population differences, but they're basically the same thing. The other popular equation was the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation. I'm not sure if I pronounced St. Jeor correctly, but that's okay. And they realized that having a kind of sex characteristic didn't improve the study as much as accounting for fat-free mass. So they also had a different set of data, and they found that, as you can see right here, there are slight differences in their people compared to Cunningham and Katch-McCardle. Now I'm going to point this out now because I think it's really important. The standard deviation, so the amount of variance of the mean for most of these equations, is about 200 calories. Pretty much every single equation is like 200 to 210. So that means if you have your mean, right, think back to stats 101, you have one standard deviation on each side. That's going to be 68% of your kind of population. So plus 200 to minus 200. Now, if you take another standard deviation, 2 standard deviations out, now you're plus 400 or minus 400, you have 97% of your population. So most people would fall in that plus or minus 400. Plus or minus 400 calories is a ton. Like that's like 2 slices of pizza. So we have to take some of these equations with a grain of salt. I will point out that the Mifflin equation was on a much larger data set than the previous data sets, and they used skinfold to calculate fat-free mass. Now that might be better considering the time it was published, but it's also more accessible to you and I because I can take your skinfold and get some decent data. So their equation, they have a body weight equation and a fat-free mass equation that are pretty good. All right, so moving on to the Owen and the Mueller. The Owen equations were published in 1986 for female equation, 87 for male. Scientists like to do this sometimes. But what they found was in their population, the Harris-Benedict was over-predicting resting energy expenditure. So it was like a 15% positive. So now you can imagine if you're set at 2,000 calories and you're eating 15% more than that, you're probably going to gain weight. We don't necessarily want to do this. This is a basal metabolic rate equation. We're not trying to change anything right now. We just want to find out where we should be at. So they had their data. They graphed it. They said that didn't work, so we made a new equation. Cool. Now, moving on to the Mueller equation. When I posted this so I went through a series on Instagram, and someone pointed out, they asked me, are you going to do the Mueller equation? And I was like, well, I didn't really think I was going to, but enough people kind of messaged me, and I was like, okay, well, I should do that. Because it's one of the larger studies and equations. So there's about 2,500 people, and they're all in Germany, which is not as comparable to maybe America or North America or South America in general, but it is a good data set. And you can see that here. And their difference between their fat-free mass equation, which is the top one, and the body weight equation, bottom one, the R's on that, so the correlation between those two, it is very, very similar. So that's one of the other reasons I included it. So that would be a good equation maybe if you're European or have more in kind of like that. Yeah. Moving on. Let me stumble through, grab a drink for a second. Okay, so now what most people care about. If you follow me, if you're using this, you're probably some type of athlete, maybe a recreational, maybe a sport, maybe a physique. And I pulled two of the popular equations for that. So the De Lorenzo equation was on 51 male athletes, and these athletes were water polo, judo, karate, so kind of odd athletes, very important, but very kind of non-traditional. And they exercised at least 3 hours per day, so they basically had 3 hours of practice a day. And they found that the formula they created using indirect calorimetry was more accurate than pretty much anything else, than the WHO, the Harris Benedict, the Owen, Cunningham, FAO, like any of those. So they said, well, our equation is the best. Granted, they didn't have any females, so if you're a female, you probably wouldn't want to use that equation because males generally have more muscle mass, would have a higher BMR. So that equation would probably overpredict if you're a female. So in 2014, a little bit more recently, Tin Half, I think that's how I pronounce it, looked at Dutch athletes, and these are recreational Dutch athletes who train 10 hours a week. Now we're getting to something a little more similar to what the recreational athlete will do. And they found that in their subset of athletes, the Cunningham equation did pretty well. It actually did almost as well as the equation they created. But their equation still outperformed the Cunningham. Now, the last one and the most recent one, this is actually from 2019, Grant Tinsley et al. Measured, I think it was 17 males and about 10 females, and measured their metabolic rate via indirect calorimetry. And it was the off season, so they weren't like preparing for competition or anything. And he found the equation here. Now he did a mass and then a fat-free mass equation. It seems pretty simple because most people again don't have access to great measures for fat-free mass. I believe his fat-free mass measurement was done with a DEXA, maybe an in-body. Not entirely sure. But again, lots of equations to choose from. You want to choose the one that's most applicable to you. So if I go to this nice chart I made, I'm kind of in the way here, but we go back over it later. So you can decide what equation you're going to do based on whether or not you know your lean body mass. So yes, that means my equations are going to be a little more accurate then, because most of metabolic rate change is dictated by lean mass. You can go athlete, yes, sport, or physique. Physique athletes generally have more muscle, so that's why I did that one. Sport athletes train a good bit, but the 10 half, they weren't training a ton. So maybe that's like your recreational, like weekend warrior type thing. As I mentioned earlier, let me just move myself out of the way. The Mifflin for skin fold. If you can get into a DEXA, Cunningham, underwater weight, most people can't have access to that anymore. It's pretty rare, but it's very accurate. The Owen equation, and then Mueller actually used BIA and skinfold, but I put BIA here because there was no BIA on any other ones. So if you don't know your lean body mass, you're basically stuck with Gym Pop being either Mifflin or Owen, based on their data and their equations. Physique, again, you're still at the Tinsley because they have a body weight one. And if you're sport, you're male, you're De Lorenzo. I would say that would be the one you would pick if you're a little more active. So maybe if you played sports a couple times a week, like soccer or football or basketball, or something where you move a good bit. And then female are kind of relegated to the 10 half because they don't have their own sport athlete equation. Now that should change, so you'll have to check back in with me on Instagram to see if I've updated this chart and see if any new equations have been published since I made this. All right, so next we have physical activity. This is a little bit more simple. So we have sedentary, lightly active, moderately active, very active, and extra active. Don't be extra. Well, maybe in this case we want to be. And to describe these, we have a few words, right? And it's very dependent on yourself. So I, for example, if I want to find my maintenance calories, I'm somewhere in between sedentary and lightly active. I tell most people, if you want to lose weight, pick a lower physical activity level. I have only worked with a handful of people who are extra active or very active. Generally, you're going to fall into the very or extra active. Well, extra actives are basically pro and amateur athletes who dedicate their lives to training. The very active, moderately active, kind of if you have a heavy labor job, you may fall into that category just because you burn a lot of calories during the day. And then depending on how much you train, right? If you work and let's say in construction all day, and then you go like do hard workouts, you're going to burn a ton of calories. Male or female, does not matter. So you may want to float that way. And when we look at these activity levels, they very much, because they're multipliers, right, affect how many calories we're going to pick. So sedentary, for me, this is what I calculated with my Harris-Benedict equation, 16, 17 calories. It's kind of low, but using their equation, I did a physical activity factor. You can see it basically increases by, 300 calories per level. And I think from what I'm eating and what I'm tracking, I would fall into this lightly active category for the Harris-Benedict equation. And that's the original, I believe. Now, give you a little more detail. I am male, 32, 147 centimeters. My body weight's about 75 kilos. It might be a little bit heavier. COVID, quarantine, kind of happens. Didn't have access to a gym for a while there. I'm sure you understand. Lean mass was done via DEXA. Fat mass, about 13%. Maybe a little bit more again right now. But, life is life. And you can see the range of numbers that I have. I have everything from the Harris-Benedict at 16, 17 to the Tinsley at 2,000. Now, I'm a physique athlete. I've competed a number of times. And I look at the Tinsley and I go, okay, yes, that would be accurate if I picked the right physical activity factor. While others could be accurate if I picked just a higher activity factor, right? So we keep that in mind. And if you look across the board, just applying that secondary physical activity factor, we see a bigger range, so 2,000 to 2,500. Now, I am probably, on this chart, somewhere between the Harris-Benedict and the Ketch-McArdle. But you can see if you averaged all of these, which I mentioned earlier, right? If you go in and you're like, let me just average this, so you're going to fall probably 2,300 calories, which wouldn't be terrible, but taking a bunch of numbers and averaging them doesn't really have any scientific rationale, so that's why we don't do it. So we have all of these variables, and we have equations, we have activity multipliers, we have body composition, right? You can weigh the same and be completely different compositions. We have NEAT, which changes massively and is different between people quite a bit. And you have goals, macronutrient ratios. And we really need to understand, and I hope that's kind of what you've learned part of today, what's behind these equations and what the components of your REE are. So just to remind you, BMR, largest percentage of TDEE, and therefore you really need to accurately estimate it. Moving on, so the thermic effect of food is the increase in metabolism after you eat. So let's say I go have some lunch, my body temperature rises. It's very, very subtle, like I'm not talking like 2 degrees like you have a fever, it's just very subtle. But it rises about 10%. And also known as diet-induced thermogenesis. So if you ever hear that, that's where that comes from. So macronutrients have different thermic effects. Protein has the highest, 20 to 30%. That's quite a bit. Carbohydrates, a little bit less, 5 to 10%. And fat has the least. Now, this is where you have to be careful with, SECO, right? Where calories in, calories out. Because if you compare two extremes, just for the sake of comparison, the carnivore diet, which is like mostly protein, right, versus the keto diet, which is mostly fat, you can imagine there are some massively different thermic effect of foods, which could downstream, if you do them long enough, affect your energy expenditure and intake and influence whether you gain or lose weight. So very important there. And we even have other factors that can influence TEF. We have age. There's a study that shows it may decrease with age. There's a study that shows that physical activity might increase thermic effect of food. I just showed you more protein and carbohydrates increase TEF, and it's not to an extent to where like you can eat only carbs and protein and you'll lose weight or anything. The general rules still apply. It's just when we get to extremes for long periods, some weird things can happen. Eating speed, there's two studies that indicate that eating speed, if you eat slower, you can increase your TEF. My parents always yelled at me about eating too fast, so maybe they had some merit to it. Meal size, so if it's 10% and it's pretty standard, and you eat more, you would kind of just guess that, hey, my thermic effect of food is going to be more. Now this goes against the kind of 6 small meals a day thing, so I would kind of take this with a grain of salt. We can't really stoke the metabolism, but this study, for example, may have been more of an artifact or kind of a one-off than translating to say, oh, we should just have one massive meal. Yeah. So lastly, meal timing. So there's a good bit of literature showing that food in the morning is better just in general for your health. And TEF is one of those reasons. The other reasons are insulin sensitivity, so you're generally more insulin sensitive in the morning. Now, things people don't often talk about is the whole food versus processed food. Processed food, like I grew up on processed food. It was easy. You go down to the store, you get a sandwich, you have a ham and cheese sandwich, right? Now, later I learned that there's a difference between a white bread and wheat bread. There's a difference between natural, like cheese, and super processed, like that Kraft stuff. And they all have a place. But this study showed that when you eat whole food, and in this case it was natural cheese and wheat bread versus white bread and that Kraft cheese that I mentioned, you have a higher metabolic rate, and it's so minimal. It's like a couple calories for that meal. But again, if you add these things up over years and years and years of habits, they could probably add up to maybe, I don't know, a pound or something. You get the picture. There's also another study that measured the increase in TDEE with different protein compositions. So we have low, moderate, and high. So that's a meal with 12, 20, or 25% of calories by protein. So the calories were the same, just they had more protein as you go right across the slide. And the low to moderate, it's not a big difference, but that high protein, that was a significant increase in the percent of TDEE. So another win for protein. Next, moving on, we'll get out of food for a bit. The NEAT, or non-exercise adaptive thermogenesis. This is what you do when you fidget, you're walking, you're laying. This is just natural. This is how you move. Now, I've had clients who walk like 15,000 steps a day, and they are just active and fidgeting, and you could just look at them and say, no, your NEAT is ridiculously high. And then I have people like me during prep whose NEAT is on the floor because I'm fatigued. So we have to take that into account. And in fact, NEAT is the biggest kind of variable in TDEE because we have people who move a ton and don't move at all. So when you're talking to your clients, you're trying to find that TDEE, make sure you kind of say, you know, you move way more than any of my other clients. So maybe we need to pick a formula that's a little overestimation. And part of the reason NEAT has decreased for a lot of people is because life has gotten easier. We love the fact that, you know, I can dial an Uber and get a meal or get a ride somewhere. Like, it didn't used to be like that. So technology, infrastructure has made life easier, but again, it's reduced our total activity, sitting all day in an office rather than working, you know, on an assembly line or something back in the day. It's a big difference. Okay, next I just wanted to show you some different variables to give you an idea of what each thing and how much it increases your TDEE above rest, your metabolic rate above rest. So sitting obviously doesn't take much energy. Standing takes a little more, so maybe there's a little merit to the standing desks, maybe not. I do enjoy standing occasionally when I work. Chewing gum, yeah, right. So as long as it's not like sugar-laden gum that's going to increase your calories, that a little bit of metabolic rate increase. Fidgeting, so you know, you see people, they like to move and just tap their toes and all that stuff, was super annoying for other people, but for them it's actually beneficial. And then stair climbing is obviously very high, and walking you can see is kind of like a linear increase. The faster you walk, the more distance you cover, the more energy you burn, and the more increase in TDEE you have. All right, so next I wanted to point out something from a study. I can't remember who this is from, but it basically breaks down lean and obese people based on BMI, and it just measured the amount of minutes per day they either lie, sat, or stood and moved. So they lie about the same, that's basically sleeping. They sit, so an obese person seems to sit a lot more than a lean person, and that difference is obviously the last thing left in standing and moving around. So lean people tend to move more. I am a proponent of a high flux system, so I would rather eat more and move more than eat less and move less. Okay, the other thing is NEAT is a huge way to increase or decrease your weight, increase your calories you're burning. It's often one of the first things I tell people to do, and that can be park farther away from the store, take the stairs, go for a walk. Walks are lovely. You can listen to your favorite podcast. You listen to me. Check my last podcast out. You can wash your hands, COVID, but wash dishes by hand. I bike to work, so I bike to lab. It's like a mile. It's perfect. You can stand and pace while watching TV. I've started doing that more, or even have like, you know, a little bike or something that you like to ride while you're sitting around. Walking meetings are another one, kind of getting traction in academia. Not really, but I like to think they are. Fidget, you know, you could just be awkward all the time. And then you can also schedule moving breaks. You can adapt your environment to make you move more. It's just annoying, but you may need to do it if you want to lose weight. If you want to gain weight, maybe you don't. So next we're going to go into Log Smarter, and before that I wanted to revisit this kind of diagram that I created. I want to revisit it for one reason, and that is to say it's not perfect, and it should be changed over time. It's just something to guide you, right? It's based on scientific principles, but that doesn't mean it's 100% correct. So keep that in mind when you're using it to find your TDEE. And if you have any questions, shoot me a message. Now, once you find your maintenance calories, what do? How do you know it's maintenance? Well, you have to weigh yourself every day. We recommend 2 weeks, and in fact, in Log Smarter, that's what we would like to see is 2 weeks of data to make sure that we're on track. So this is my data over 2 weeks, and you can see this is a little bit less variable than normal. So I start at 165, my highest is 166, my lowest is 164. So I have, plus or minus 2 pounds. And if I average that across the week, there's pretty much no change. Now, if I pick my TDE and I did see a change, so you can see this slow, very, very slow increase up with a weekly average of 165.18, 166.14. There's not a huge difference in there, but I would say, okay, I probably need to adjust my calories. I have seen, it seems like I gained weight, and that's what I would do. Log Smarter does that automatically. Now, to give you an even more specific example, remember from before, 2,200 calories, my maintenance. Well, I gained about a pound. Maintenance too high, so I'm going to drop my calories by, was that 300? So you can kind of use the 3,500 calories in a pound rule. So that would be, 2,100 calories in a week. Difference between these two, not quite a pound, but I'm going to say there's some fluctuation in here too. And then I repeat my tracking, and if it stabilizes, good to go. Now, if I'm gaining muscle, that might be an issue. If I could be like losing fat and gaining muscle, recomping. If I was new, that could be an issue, or coming off a layoff. So you have to keep a lot of these things in mind. So now I'm going to go over our Log Smarter algorithm app and kind of give you an idea of how we develop this without too much insight. Got to keep some secrets. So in Log Smarter, we have features, and these are height, weight, age, activity level, BMI, and gender. So that's stuff you give us. And we give you a TDEE estimate. So you input your raw data, you have a baseline. That's calculated from our equations. And then over the next 2 weeks, or hopefully however long you use Log Smarter, it will adjust for you based on your goal. If you want to gain weight, we'll get into that. We have some recommendations. If you want to lose weight, we have some recommendations for that too. But ultimately, we're giving you maintenance calories. And this is a tool to say, all right, I know my baseline, and now I want to do X, Y, or Z. So this data is based off of over 700 people with doubly labeled water. One of the biggest and best data sets that is available. We have people ranging from 20 to 96. So this is not just applicable to 25-year-olds who are physique athletes. This is applicable to everyone. Average age is 50 or 49. Heights, again, across the board, a lot of variance there. We have so many people, which is good, because otherwise we would kind of be concerned about, our data's too spread out. But we know our data's correct because it's doubly labeled water, which is the best method to measure TDEE. We have BMIs, so we have lean people, 18.5, and we have very obese people, 61. And then on average, our TDEE is 2,600 about, but it goes all the way up to 5,000 and all the way down to 1,000. So a very diverse population. So this is built, again, on a very good data set. Now, we have guidelines, once you find your maintenance, to help you diet or bulk or cut or gain, whatever you want to call it. So dieting first. So we have a conservative approach. This is very conservative, which is a 200 to 300 calorie deficit. This is if you're already pretty lean, if you want to kind of not lose muscle, or potentially try it a lot, not lose muscle. We have a moderate approach, which is pretty standard. It's 300 to 500 calories. And we recommend this. It's a good place to start. Just get your feet wet. And this is like, you're dieting slow, you should be fine, you won't lose any muscle, hopefully. But if you do it for a long time, you might. And again, most people don't love dieting, so we do have an aggressive and a very aggressive option. For those of you who are athletes, you might want to be aggressive if you like to grind and really get after it for a shorter amount of time. And then the very aggressive approach is people who are overweight or obese. This is akin to crash dieting, and I would not recommend this for more than 6 weeks or so, unless you have a ton of weight. If you have to like lose 100 pounds or something, then there may be rationale for using this approach. But again, if you fall into the extremes, contact me and I'll walk you through it. So the flip side of cutting is bulking. Way more fun. Build muscle, eat more, just generally better. So we have a conservative approach, 100 to 250 calories. This is a very good approach if you're very experienced. So like I've been training for 15, 17 years or something like that. I've kind of gotten all the gains that I'm going to get. The rest of them are going to be very minimal. Maybe 3 to 5 pounds over the next 5 to 7 years. So this is the approach that I take, the conservative approach. Now, you can take a more moderate approach if you're younger or if you haven't been training as long, right? You're past those newbie gains. You want to gain a little muscle. You don't care too much about gaining fat. Then I would choose that one. And then lastly, if you're like brand new to training and you're super lean or skinny or whatever you want to call it, and you want to put on some muscle at a good pace, you can take advantage of those like new to training or untrained adaptations. That first year, you just put on 10 pounds of muscle or something crazy. This is the approach that you could take aggressive. I would be very cautious with this because you don't want to put on too much weight too quickly. All right, so once you figure out what you want to do, once you think about this presentation, head over to LogSmarter, or you're already here, and check out our software. I will end there. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm the CSO, robertsb21@gmail.com. Hit me up, and I will see you around.